Good day. Germany and France, or to be more precise, their foreign ministers, have now published a joint statement on the situation in Ukraine. In my opinion, this joint statement underlines the point made in my last programme discussing this topic, which is that the fever point in the crisis of the last few weeks, following the Ukrainian military build-up on the ceasefire line between Ukraine and the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, that this fever point is now passing and that the worst of the crisis is most probably over. I say this because the statement the Germans and the French have published quite clearly makes Germany's and France's opposition to a Ukrainian offensive in eastern Ukraine and a conflict there entirely clear to anyone who knows how to read these statements properly. In this programme, I'm going to read out that statement, I'm going to then pass it, and I'm then going to contrast it with the rather different comments that President Biden made in his conversation with Ukraine's President Zelenskyy just a few days before. First of all, here's the statement from the Germans and the French. It's fairly short. I'm going to read it in full. France and Germany are concerned by the growing number of ceasefire violations in eastern Ukraine, which come after the situation had stabilized since July 2020. We are closely monitoring the situation and in particular Russian troop movements and call on all sides to show restraint and to work towards the immediate de-escalation of tensions. We reaffirm our support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. As mediators in the Normandy 4 format, France and Germany are continuing their efforts to see the Minsk agreements implemented in full, and regular negotiations are being held to that end. In this regard, we welcome the extension of the mandate of the OSCE's Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine and call for an end to the restrictions on the mission's freedom of movement so that it can accomplish its objectives in accordance with its mandate. Now, let's pass this statement line by line. It's, as I said, fairly short. I'm not going to deal much with the last paragraph, which deals with the OSCE, though there is something to be said about that too. First of all, let's go to the very first sentence. France and Germany are concerned by the growing number of ceasefire violations in eastern Ukraine, which come after the situation had stabilized since July 2020. Now, the immediate thing that stands out from that sentence is that there is no reference here to who is responsible for those ceasefire violations. Obviously, the Germans and the French, who are allied with Ukraine, as the next part of their statement makes clear, do not want to blame Ukraine itself. But notably and significantly, they are not blaming the two breakaway republics, Donetsk and Lugansk, and their armed forces for the ceasefire violations, and nor are the French and the Germans blaming Russia. Now, in a statement of this nature, where the French and the Germans blame neither the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics for ceasefire violations or Russia, that means, in effect, that they are blaming Ukraine. As I said, since they're allied with Ukraine, they're not in a position to state that it is Ukraine that is breaking the ceasefire and do so explicitly, but their statement strongly implies it. Then they go on to say the following: we are closely monitoring the situation and in particular Russian troop movements. Well, of course they are. Obviously they are. But again, note that there is no word of condemnation of Russia here. They are monitoring the Russian troop movements. They don't say that the Russian troop movements are inappropriate. Now here I'm going to turn to what Joe Biden said in his conversation with Zelenskyy. Here are his words. President Joseph R. Biden, all right, here's the White House readout. President Joseph R. Biden spoke today to President Volodymyr Zelenskyy of Ukraine. President Biden affirmed the United States' unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of Russia's ongoing aggression in the Donbass and Crimea. No reference in the French and German statement to Russian aggression, which is so clearly set out in the White House's readout of the telephone conversation between Biden and Zelenskyy. In one case, we hear denunciations of Russia, that is in the Biden-Zelenskyy call. In the French-German statement, those denunciations of Russian aggression are notably absent. Then the call goes on to say the following: we call on all sides to show restraint and to work towards the immediate de-escalation of tensions. Now, all sides obviously includes Ukraine. And this part of the statement, which is, by the way, the single most important part of the statement, is in effect a way for the French and the Germans to tell Ukraine that they do not support and will not support a Ukrainian offensive in eastern Ukraine, and that Ukraine should not undertake it. That is what these words say. Ukraine should show restraint and work towards the immediate de-escalation of tensions. Now that means withdrawing Ukrainian forces from the combat line and returning to the situation that was agreed in July 2020, when there was an agreed ceasefire, which, as the statement said in the previous sentence, created a stabilization of the situation in eastern Ukraine. So, every side must show restraint, every side must work towards the immediate de-escalation of tensions, and that, of course, as I said, includes Ukraine, made in conjunction with the absence of any condemnation of Russia or of the two breakaway republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. The meaning here is entirely clear. It is Ukraine that has initiated this current crisis, and it is Ukraine that must take steps to de-escalate it by withdrawing its forces, that if Ukraine does, the Russians should do so also. Now, the next paragraph is perhaps even more interesting. We reaffirm our support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Now, that is a recognition of Ukraine as on the basis of its previous borders, which, by the way, would include Crimea, but it is spoken about in extraordinarily measured and moderate language. We go back again to the contrast with the White House readout of the Biden-Zelenskyy call. President Biden affirmed the United States' unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of Russia's ongoing aggression in the Donbass and Crimea. So the French and the Germans merely express support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. The Americans talk about unwavering support. The French and the Germans talk about territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, something, by the way, which might implicitly open the way for those borders to be changed if there is international recognition of the fact, whilst the American readout says that the borders will include Donbass and Crimea, referred to by name, in the face of Russia's aggression. Note that the European statement makes no reference either to Donbass or Crimea, and as I said before, does not refer to Russia's ongoing aggression. Then the next section is even more interesting. As mediators in the Normandy format, France and Germany are continuing their efforts to see the Minsk agreements implemented in full, and regular negotiations are being held to that end. So, the French and the Germans here are reiterating their support for the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements required negotiations between the people whom Putin, in his conversation with Merkel and Macron last week, referred to as the Kiev authorities, in other words, the Ukrainian government, and the authorities of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. That is clearly and fully set out within the Minsk agreement. The French and the Germans are implicitly supporting that. They're talking about full implementation of the Minsk agreements in this statement. Now, the French and the Germans, when they do this, are beyond question aware that Ukraine has steadily sought to pull back and pull out of its commitments to the Minsk agreements. They have consistently refused to negotiate with the leaders of the two breakaway republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, and in fact they have recently been issuing a series of statements and laws and doctrines in Kiev, all of which refer to the conflict in eastern Ukraine as an international conflict or even a war, suggesting that the two parties to the conflict are Ukraine itself and Russia. Ukraine denies that the conflict in eastern Ukraine is an internal one. It says that Ukraine is the object of Russian aggression. The White House readout of the telephone conversation between Biden and Zelenskyy reaffirms and supports that. The French and German statement, however, directly contradicts it. It refers to the Minsk agreements. It says that Ukraine must fulfill them in full, and the Minsk agreement expressly recognizes the conflict as an internal one, not a conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and requires Ukraine to negotiate directly with the leaders of the two breakaway republics as a way of ending the conflict in Ukraine. It is a radically different perspective from the Ukrainian one and from the American one, and on this issue aligns the French and the Germans clearly with the Russian understanding of the conflict, which also says that it is an internal one between different Ukrainian parties. And lastly, we then have the last paragraph, which I will only touch on very briefly. In this regard, we welcome the extension of the mandate of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine and call for an end to the restrictions on the mission's freedom of movement so that it can accomplish its objectives in accordance with its mandate. In other words, they back the OSCE mission in eastern Ukraine, And that means implicitly and quite, in fact, not implicitly, quite openly, that they are backing the ceasefire on the contact line, which the OSCE mission appears is set up to monitor. So here we have it. The French and the Germans are refusing to back a Ukrainian offensive in eastern Ukraine. They're telling the Ukrainians that they want the Ukrainians to de-escalate, which means in effect that they want the Ukrainians to pull their forces from the conflict line back. They also want Ukraine to fulfill its obligations under the Minsk agreements by entering, in effect, into direct negotiations with the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and they also, in effect and implicitly, as recognize the conflict in Ukraine as an internal one. There is a marked difference here between the European perspective of this conflict and the American one, and there is also an implicit rebuke to Ukraine in this statement, by in effect implicitly accepting that it is Ukraine that has been taking the steps to escalate the conflict, and that it is Ukraine that should therefore take the steps to de-escalate. All of this is implicit in the statement, but it is quite obvious to anyone familiar with the conflict and with the text and context of the Minsk agreements, and who has read this statement carefully and passes its provisions precisely. So, what do I conclude is going to happen? Zelenskyy and his defense minister contacted the United States. They got verbal statements of support from President Biden and from Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. But these, it seemed to me, as I discussed in a previous program, stopped well short of backing for an offensive, a military offensive in eastern Ukraine. On the contrary, Biden, in his first conversation with Zelenskyy since Biden became president, seems to have taken steps to divert the entire topic of discussion away from the ongoing crisis in eastern Ukraine to a discussion of the issues of corruption and reform within Ukraine itself, something which would not have been welcome to Zelenskyy at that time. The French and the Germans are going much further. They're making very clear that they oppose an escalation of the situation in eastern Ukraine. They do not want to see an attack by Ukraine on the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. They recognize that if such an attack happens, there will be a strong Russian reaction, which they absolutely do not want to see. And they are basically calling in this statement for Ukraine to de-escalate and to return to the ceasefire negotiated in July 2020 and monitored by the OSCE monitoring mission. In other words, they are calling on Ukraine to pull back. At the same time, in this statement, they are reaffirming their support for the Minsk agreements, which recognizes the conflict in Ukraine as an internal one and requires Ukraine to negotiate directly with the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, something which Ukraine has consistently refused to do. Also, they implicitly recognize that Ukraine's conflict is internal, not a case of external aggression upon Ukraine by Russia, which is the American position and also, by the way, the British one. So, in effect, the Europeans are signaling that they want an end to the tension on the ceasefire line now, and that they are opposed to a Ukrainian offensive in eastern Ukraine. Where does that leave us? I'm going to say it quite straightforwardly. I think that faced by a statement like this, it becomes very unlikely, to put it mildly, that Ukraine will indeed launch an offensive in eastern Ukraine. I think it is extremely difficult for any Ukrainian government, whether led as previously by President Poroshenko or as led now by President Zelenskyy, to launch an offensive against German and French and therefore EU opposition, especially when it is set out as clearly as it is in this statement. The Ukraine depends on German and French and European support for its economic survival. The Germans and the French know that who pays the piper in Ukraine calls the tune, and the Ukrainians know that also. So, in the face of this opposition, and in the face of what the Germans and the French refer to as ongoing negotiations, I expect over the course of the next few days and weeks that we will see a drawdown in the fighting in eastern Ukraine, most probably a pullback by the Ukrainian troops, and a return to the situation as it existed before, after July 2020, when a ceasefire was negotiated. I think, in fact, that this could very well turn out to be a watershed moment in the Ukrainian crisis, because, as I've also said, this is, to my knowledge, the first occasion that the French and the Germans have come out with a statement which implicitly rebukes and contradicts the American line on Ukraine. They refuse to talk about Russian aggression on Ukraine. They recognize it as an internal conflict, and when they talk about Ukraine being recognized, supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, but do not refer by name to the Donbass and Crimea, as the United States does, they may be signaling that at some point in future, the secession from Ukraine of Crimea and Donbass might become internationally recognized. Now, whether this will actually amount to anything, whether the French and the Germans will one day move forward and will negotiate a comprehensive settlement with the Russians of the Ukrainian crisis along these kind of lines, remains to be seen. Obviously, there would be strong Ukrainian and American and British opposition, though it has to be said that for the Germans and the French and the EU as a whole, the solution to this conflict ultimately lies in their hands, this being a conflict in Europe, which the United States has only a certain influence over. But anyway, that remains to be seen, and I doubt that we were going to get a negotiation and a settlement on those lines anytime soon. As for Ukraine itself, this episode once again underlines a fundamental truth which has existed ever since the fighting in eastern Ukraine ended, the main fighting ended in February 2015. This is that the Europeans are strongly and staunchly opposed to any attempt by Ukraine to reconquer the Donbass by force. And in light of this, Ukraine itself has only one way forward, which is to negotiate directly at some point with the leaders of the Donbass republics, as they are required to do under the Minsk Accords. The Ukrainians will not get support from the Europeans, from the Germans and the French, if they attempt to reconquer the Donbass by force, by insisting that they will not negotiate with the leaders of the two Donbass republics, and by treating the conflict as an international one. Ukraine is trapping itself into the limbo in which it now finds itself, where it cannot move forward and it cannot move back, but is trapped in a condition of perpetual war on its eastern border, and is unable to resolve the situation there, either militarily or diplomatically. Whether there is wisdom or understanding of this in Ukraine, or whether the political situation in Ukraine itself makes understanding of this possible there, is of course another matter. Now, given that this is so, and given the pathologies, if you like, within Ukraine itself, it is possible that the Ukrainians, faced by a dead-end situation, may one day decide that they're simply going to go for broke, launch an offensive in eastern Ukraine, be defeated there, and come to a resolution of this crisis, which would lead to the breakup of Ukraine in a way that is achieved through fighting and war, and which is imposed on them rather than which they have negotiated. Sometimes it is psychologically easier to accept an outcome as a result of a glorious defeat than to accept that outcome as a result of negotiations. That may come one day. It's entirely possible that it will. However, my guess is that it won't come now. I think on balance, Zelenskyy and the people who advise him in Kiev are not prepared to sacrifice their own positions and to see the breakup of Ukraine happen in this way at this time. Nothing about Zelenskyy himself suggests to me that he is that kind of personality who is prepared to go for broke in that way. That is what also leads me to think, by the way, that the talk about a ceasefire, which is now coming from Kiev, is for real, and that we will see a Ukrainian drawdown over the next few weeks. Well, this has been a long and involved program again, in which I've discussed at some length the latest diplomatic moves. Thank you for sticking with me through to the end of it, if you've come this far. The next few weeks will show if I am right. And in the meantime, I thank you again for joining me on this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and in our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. And please also look up his channel and our new channel, where we show the interactions with our viewers on our live streams. You will find links under this video. Please also check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially Odyssey, which we found to be an excellent platform. And please also, to the extent that you can and feel able, support us through Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. Please remember that we accept donations in all forms of currency, including the new currencies such as Bitcoin. Last but not least, please don't forget to check out our shop, see the wonderful things we have there, our amazing magic mugs, our wonderful t-shirts, 100% cotton, long-sleeved and short-sleeved, our hats, our hoodies and our sweatshirts, all of them decorated with the Duran's own double-headed eagle and with the flags of various countries, showing that we are indeed an international channel that looks all over the world and is interested in geopolitics wherever they take place. Thank you for joining me on this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, and have a wonderful day until then.